It is no secret that racial injustices, stereotypes, and racism exist in the world we live in today. This begs the question of where it all comes from. Out of nowhere? Out of the actions that the minority does? Maybe a combination of a lot of different things. I'm here to argue and explain how the atrocious act of slavery led to racism and stereotypes of the African American community then and now. To begin, we have to go back to the colonial times. In the early 17th century, labor needs were satisfied by mostly white indentured servants from England. Unemployed and destitute Englanders, and increasingly Scots and Irish, would sell themselves into service to a Virginia or Maryland landowner for 7 years of labor for the price of their passage across the Atlantic. Once their service was done, the servants could then work for themselves and go about their lives. It was always understood that the indentured servants would be freed after 7 years. When the boom of people traveling to America began to subside, plantation owners turned to slavery to grow their crops. Before slavery, Africans had much more freedoms, though still limited. They were allowed to marry white men and women if baptized. They could also petition for their freedom. They could also own land. Virginia then began to implement laws that codified slavery, making it for life. This basically stripped away all the previous rights they once had. The Pardist Doctrine, which stated that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of their mother. This begins the notion that slavery causes discrimination for African Americans, especially in this time period. All men are created equal. This quote began to have people question if African Americans were included in this or not. The northern states wished to abolish slavery. The slaves were few in the North. The South did not want this, for they relied on the slaves for profit and for them to run the plantations. The South would rather have slavery than to have free slaves, remembering how they were treated with slavery. So the South doubled down on slavery and racial discrimination. Between 1790 and 1860, the number of slaves in America grew from 900,000 to 4 million slaves. The cotton gin made slavery much more profitable. In 1808, the slave trade was closed off and no slaves were allowed in from outside the country. They could still be bought from states on the Atlantic seaboard. At this time, the slaves were not only mistreated and held against their will, they were also used as numbers to gain political clout and power for the white men that owned them. Slavery was not only benefiting the white men in control with a profit, they also got to use the slavery population to have more say to vote to keep slavery around. This kind of manipulation shows the growth of African American stereotypes that they are beneath white men and only good for things with their hands and to be treated like animals. In Bennett Burroughs' journal, we can see rules he has laid out for his slaves, further cementing the notion that they were treated far less than and discriminated towards because they were viewed as property and not as people. Rules were such things as no slave leaving the place at any time without permission. They must tend to and look after the plantation if there were to be danger such as a fire, and that no general passes were given for the slaves to come and go as they please. This created an atmosphere where the slaves were entirely dependent on the slaveholder. They were given bare minimum for materials for living, such as blankets, food, and so on. Burrough also had punishments for breaking any and all of these rules. These punishments were such as whipping. If they were to break any rules or not make the quota they were assigned, they were also beat, and they were also put in jail on the plantation. Moving on from the conditions the slaves were put through, we see the yeoman farmers. The yeoman farmers were simple farmers that didn't own slaves and were below the more powerful white men and plantation owners. Even though they were viewed as less than, even they prided themselves on being better than and above the slaves. This is shown through them participating in slave patrols from when they tried to escape. This let the human farmers still feel a part of the system and above the slaves, even though they were beneath the plantation owners. We began to see the stereotype on how white people and slave owners feel towards African Americans. They felt that they were going to steal and ruin the land and the area if they were to be set free, so they kept them enslaved. They basically did this to themselves and created the stereotypes with the circumstances they created for the African Americans and slaves at this time. They began to feel afraid of the slaves, afraid of them uprising or causing a riot, and they were scared of them as if they were savage animals. After slavery was abolished, there was still issues that black Americans faced with Jim Crow laws and discrimination. This was a direct side effect of slavery and the continuation on the stereotypes and thoughts on former slaves and African Americans as a whole. This wasn't all out of nowhere either. The slaves were not huge fans of their masters that would whip and punish them, as shown in the stories told in the Federal Writers Project. The Black Codes of Mississippi show how people wanted African Americans to still be below everyone, even after slavery created prejudice and negative stereotypes for Black Americans, such as being thought of less than. This ran true for countless years and still continues today. Racism ran so deep that most Southern legislators regarded themselves as complying with the letter of the law, but also keeping African Americans in their proper socially subordinate and separate place. This led to Jim Crow laws and making it more legal to separate and discriminate against African Americans. All this racism and discrimination can be tracked back to slavery. During the period after World War I, many African Americans moved to Northern America. They settled in large numbers and created their own communities of mostly African Americans. The Harlem Renaissance was a perfect cultural movement example of this. We start to see the birth of their own culture where they are the majority in these specific areas. With this said, they are still seen as second-class citizens to the rest of America. We begin to see how the North and all of America starts to react to the assimilation of African America in everyday life. Because of where they came from, African Americans were segregated and treated worse with the opportunities and support they were given by the government and by the racism that continued in the nation at this point in time. But they were coping with this long history of racism that left them in poor urban ghettos, neighborhoods of mostly African Americans. Little education for themselves, and poorly resourced schools for their children, and no jobs, and also an unsympathetic and sometimes oppressive police and legal system that held them in constant suspicion. Black nationalism came as a response from the fed-up African Americans on how they were treated and forced to live their lives with the laws and unspoken cultural rules going against them. Subcultures such as Malcolm X's Black Muslim communities started to pop up around 1930s, where drug abuse, criminal behavior, and alcoholism were not tolerated. This culture was formed nearly enclosed from the outside white-ruled world, exclusive to the African Americans who want a better life where they can get an education and have a life with less hate and discrimination. African Americans got put in this box and are assumed the worst of by people, and also by the police as well. This is shown in the Rodney King riots. All of these unfortunate and negative stereotypes still occur in today's world, with countless examples, ranging from a nasty look on the street to incarceration for life. It is good to understand where it all comes from and why it is the way it is today. Hopefully, we can see the absurdity of it all and respect the history behind it and get past it in time. But where we are in today's world is simply a reflection of what happened in the world before ours, with slavery. It can all be traced back by this atrocious and hateful way of living.